The cup was still warm in her hand when Cora Rourke realized she had no idea who had placed it there. She had been sitting alone on the far edge of the celebration square in Millhaven, Nevada, in the summer of 1882, watching the whole glittering, laughing world spin by without her, feeling the particular brand of invisible that only a woman carrying secret grief can feel in a crowd of 100 people. The bonfire crackled at the center of the square. Fiddles screamed. Children chased one another between the legs of dancing adults. And Cora sat on a rough-hewn bench at the edge of it all, hands folded in her lap, her dark green dress the color of a pine forest at dusk, her copper-red hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck as though she was trying to disappear into neatness. Then 2 cups of cider had appeared in her peripheral vision, held by a pair of steady, sun-darkened hands, and a quiet smile had followed. Not the wide, performative grin of a man trying to impress her, but the careful, considered smile of a man who had already decided that if she told him to go away, he would, and he would not make her feel guilty about it. She had taken the cup on instinct. Now she stared into it, heart hammering, because the man had sat down beside her without asking and without crowding her, leaving a full hand's width of space between them on the bench, and the space felt more respectful than any word she had ever been spoken to in this town. "You do not have to talk," he said simply. Cora looked up sharply, because no man had ever opened a conversation with that particular sentence, and it hit her somewhere dangerous, somewhere she had spent the last 3 years carefully bricking shut with mortar made of loss and betrayal. His name was Vernon Fletcher. She did not know it yet, but she would, and when she did, she would understand that learning it was the beginning of the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her, which was falling in love again after swearing on her husband's fresh grave that she never would. But to understand why his quiet smile undid something fundamental inside of Cora Rourke, you have to go back 3 years, to the day she arrived in Millhaven on a dusty stagecoach with a wedding ring on her finger and hope in her chest, and understand precisely how both of those things were taken from her. Cora had come west from Ohio in the spring of 1879, 24 years old and freshly married to a man named Douglas Rourke, who had promised her silver mines and a new life in the Nevada territory. Douglas was broad-shouldered and fast-talking, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the world owed him a fortune. Cora had mistaken that confidence for competence. It was a mistake she would spend years learning the shape of. The silver mine turned out to be a partial stake in a nearly exhausted claim on the south ridge of the Stillwater Range, purchased from a man who saw Douglas coming from a mile away. The house Douglas had described in his letters, a real house, Cora, with a proper parlor floor, turned out to be 2 rooms above a feed store on Millhaven's Main Street, with a ceiling that wept brown water when it rained. But Cora was not a woman who surrendered to circumstances. She learned to cook in the cramped space, learned to sew alterations for the town's women to bring in money, learned to smile pleasantly at the neighbors even when Douglas came home smelling of whiskey and failure. She told herself it would get better. She told herself that men who came west with dreams sometimes needed time to find their footing. She planted a window box of marigolds and watered them every morning and watched them turn their faces toward the Nevada sun, and she decided that she was going to bloom the same way, regardless. What she had not been prepared for, what nothing in her Ohio upbringing had given her any language for, was the particular cruelty of a man who is charming to strangers and cold to his wife. Douglas never struck her. She wanted to be clear about that in the accounting she sometimes made to herself in the small, dark hours. He was not violent. He was something subtler and in some ways worse. He was indifferent. He looked through her the way a man looks through a window he has stopped noticing. He made promises and forgot them without guilt, because the forgetting was as natural to him as breathing. He borrowed against her small earnings from the alterations work, and she only learned about it when the debt collector knocked. And then, in the winter of 1880, Douglas Rourke died. He died of pneumonia, which came on fast in the hard desert cold, and which his constitution, weakened by too much whiskey and not enough proper meals, could not fight off. He was dead in 10 days. Cora sat at his bedside for all 10 of them, bathing his forehead, spooning broth, praying in the complicated way of a woman who is not sure exactly what she is praying for. When it was over, she felt grief, real grief, the bone-deep kind, and also beneath the grief, a feeling she was ashamed of, relief. Not that Douglas was gone exactly, but that the particular performance of hoping things would be better had finally been allowed to end. The shame of that relief calcified into something inside her. She told herself she was not the kind of woman who gave her heart carelessly again. She told herself that whatever softness she had once possessed, whatever openness had let her follow Douglas Rourke west on the strength of letters and a smile, she had grown past it. She was 26 years old and widowed in a town where everyone knew her name and nobody truly knew her, and she intended to stay exactly that way. She stayed in Millhaven because she had nowhere else to go and because, honestly, she had come to love the high desert light and the way the mountains held the sunset for an extra half-hour every evening. She continued her alterations work. She saved carefully. She bought the 2 rooms above the feed store outright when the landlord offered, because owning something felt like the only real safety she had ever known. She kept the marigolds in the window box. She did not let anyone close. For 2 years she sustained this arrangement, and it worked mostly. The town accepted her. She was polite to everyone. She attended Sunday services and the occasional social event with the measured participation of a woman fulfilling a civic duty rather than seeking pleasure. She was respected, and she was lonely, and she had made peace with both those facts being true at the same time. Until the summer celebration of 1882, when 2 cups of cider appeared at her side, and a man with careful hands and a quiet smile sat down without asking, and with the decency to tell her she did not have to talk. Cora looked at Vernon Fletcher properly for the first time then, cataloging him the way a cautious person catalogs anything that might be a threat. He was tall in his frame, even sitting, broad across the shoulders in the way of a man who worked with his body rather than just displaying it. His hat was a dusty brown, set respectfully on his knee rather than his head since they were at a social occasion, and his dark hair was cut short but not with any military precision, more like a man who cut it himself when it bothered him, without vanity. His jaw was angular, shaded with a few days' growth, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the particular gray-green of sage after rain, and they carried something she was not expecting. They carried patience, not the patience of a man waiting for something he was planning to take, the patience of a man who had learned to wait because he had once lost something by rushing, and the lesson had settled into his bones. "You are new," Cora said, which was not what she had meant to say. She had meant to thank him for the cider and perhaps excuse herself. "Arrived 3 weeks ago," he said. He had a low voice, unhurried, with the faint trace of a southern origin that had been worn smooth by years of travel. "Took on the farrier work at Hendrick's stable. Old Pete Henshaw retired." "I heard Pete's hands went," Cora said, because this was safer than the other thing she wanted to say, which was, "Why did you bring me a cup?" She knew the answer, of course. She had been sitting alone at a celebration and had obviously looked like a woman sitting alone at a celebration, and he had been kind. That was all it was, kindness. She had learned not to read more into kindness. "They did," Vernon said. He looked out at the celebration, not at her, which she found she appreciated. "Beautiful country out here. I was not expecting the mountains to be so close." "Where were you before?" "Texas mostly, sometime in New Mexico territory." He paused, and she had the sense that there was more behind those words that he was choosing not to offer, which she respected. She had things she chose not to offer, too. "Before that, Georgia, long time ago." "The war," she said quietly, because she understood the geography of a man who had been in Georgia before Texas. It mapped onto the war the way a shadow maps onto a body. He nodded once. He did not say anything more about it, and she did not ask. She understood that some things were not conversation, they were just weight, and they had to be carried differently. They sat for a while in the quiet that had formed between them, which was remarkable because the celebration around them was not quiet at all. It was fiddles and boot stomping, and the bright laughter of children and the deeper laughter of men holding drinks. But the quiet existed between the two of them like a room they had walked into together. "I am Cora Rourke," she said, eventually. "Vernon Fletcher," he said, and turned to look at her then with that careful smile, and something about it made her chest do a thing she had told her chest not to do, a small dangerous opening, like a window she had nailed shut and found swinging free. She looked away quickly, back at the bonfire. "Thank you for the cider," she said. "You are welcome, Mrs. Rourke." She should have corrected him, should have said that Douglas had been dead 2 years, and she was simply Cora these days. But she did not, because the formality was a kind of distance, and distance was what she had decided she needed. What she had not accounted for was that distance, when shared with the wrong person, could collapse. The weeks after the summer celebration moved with the particular slow velocity of a Nevada summer, which is to say they moved slowly and at tremendous internal heat. Cora became aware of Vernon Fletcher the way you become aware of a color you had not noticed before. Suddenly it is everywhere, and you cannot determine whether it was always there or whether something in your eye has changed. She saw him on the main street in the mornings, when she walked to Hadley's dry goods for thread. He was always doing something purposeful, carrying iron to the forge, or walking one of Hendrick's horses through a cool-down circuit, or talking with old man Hendricks himself with the easy manner of a man who had learned to make himself useful, and was content with the dignity of that. He always saw her when she passed, and he always gave her the same slight, unhurried nod, and she always gave him the same controlled nod back. And between those two nods, an entire silent negotiation was taking place of which neither of them, she suspected, was quite willing to be the first to admit. He came into her life properly through an act of pure practicality, which is often how the most life-altering things arrive. It was a Tuesday morning in late August, dry and savage hot, when Cora descended the exterior stairs of her rooms above the feed store to discover that the step 3 from the bottom had finally surrendered to 2 years of dry rot, and her right foot had gone clean through it. She did not fall, she caught herself on the railing with both hands, but the step was beyond her ability to repair, and it was also functionally necessary, and the carpenter in town, a Mr. Glover, was occupied with a large commission for the new hotel going up on 2nd Street, and would not be free for 3 weeks. She was standing at the base of the stairs examining the damage and performing the internal arithmetic of temporary ladders versus the indignity of requesting help, when she heard footsteps and looked up to find Vernon Fletcher coming around the corner of the feed store with a bridle in his hand and an expression of mild inquiry. "Step gave out," she said, because he was looking at it. "I see that." He stopped, considered it. "You need that fixed today, not in 3 weeks. Mr. Glover is occupied." "I can fix it," Vernon said simply. He said it without flourish, without making the offer a performance of his own capability, just stated it as a fact, the way you might say the sun is in the west at this hour. Cora stood for a moment with the conflicting impulses of pride and practicality fighting it out behind her eyes, and practicality won, which it always did with her when it mattered. "I would appreciate that," she said. "I can pay you for your time." "No need," Vernon said. "There is need," Cora said firmly. "I do not accept charity." He looked at her for a moment with those sage-rain eyes, and something in them shifted almost imperceptibly, like a man revising an assumption in real time. "Then name your price," he said, "and I will accept it." She paid him in a meal, which she prepared that evening after he had replaced the rotten step with clean pine board and sealed the railing posts while he was at it. She had planned for it to be a perfunctory exchange, a plate of food left on the porch rail, a thank you, a goodbye. What she had not planned for was that he asked, very politely, if he might eat it there on the porch steps rather than take it away, because he had been eating his meals alone in the bunkhouse at Hendrick's stable for 3 weeks, and the company of another human being at supper time was something he had found himself missing. He said it without self-pity, as a plain statement of fact, and Cora, who understood what it was to sit alone in a room and eat, and have the silence fill up all the space where a voice used to be, found she could not say no. She brought out her own plate and sat on the top step while he sat on the new bottom one, and they ate as the sun performed its extended Nevada farewell behind the Stillwater Range, and they talked. Not about large things at first. About small things, the ordinary mortar of acquaintance. She asked about farriery, and he explained it without condescension. The way a man does when he genuinely loves his craft. How you read a horse through its feet the way a doctor reads a person through their pulse. How a bad shoe can ruin a good animal, and a careful correction can save one that's been suffering for months. And she told him about the alterations work, the particular puzzle of making a garment fit a body it was not made for, which was most bodies, actually, because the ready-made clothing arriving by rail from the East was made for some abstract average body that did not correspond to any real one, and her work was the translation between the ideal and the actual. Vernon Fletcher listened the way very few people listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, actually absorbing what she said and responding to what she had said specifically, rather than what he had been planning to say anyway. It was disarming in the particular way of something that should not be dangerous, but turns out to be. "You are good at that," he said, when she had finished explaining a particularly challenging alteration she had done for the mayor's wife, whose left shoulder sat higher than her right. "At sewing. At seeing what things actually are rather than what they are supposed to be," he said. "That is not a common skill." Cora looked at him. In the amber-dying light he looked carved from something warm. The sharp angles of his face softened, and she thought, I should not be noticing this. But she was, and she filed that noticing away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were complicated. "You should go before it is fully dark," she said. "The path back to Hendrick's is rough." He stood, collected his empty plate, thanked her with quiet sincerity, and went. He did not linger. He did not manufacture a reason to stay. He left when she indicated she wanted him to leave, and that was more devastating in its way than if he had argued, because it confirmed what she had been afraid of, that he was someone who respected the word no, and a person who would not honor her refusal was someone she could have stayed safely contemptuous of. A man who honors your refusal is much harder to keep at arm's length. The suppers became a fortnightly habit, by degrees so gradual that Cora could not identify exactly when the thing had crossed from occasional to regular. There was the Tuesday of the step repair. Then there was a Thursday 2 weeks later when he had been helping her neighbor Mrs. Alcott wrestle a broken cart wheel into submission, and she had offered him supper as she had offered Mrs. Alcott supper, as a matter of hospitality rather than anything specific. Then there was a Sunday evening when she had made too much stew and the alternative was waste, and Vernon Fletcher happened to be within hailing distance, and by October the fortnightly had become weekly, and the formality had been worn smooth by repetition the way river stone is worn smooth, until instead of Mrs. Rourke and Mr. Fletcher they were Cora and Vernon, at least in the privacy of the porch steps. In town, on the street, they maintained the correct distance of acquaintance. But on the porch steps in the long Nevada evenings, something else was happening. She knew it was happening. She was not naive, or rather she had been naive once and the education had been comprehensive, and she did not intend to repeat the tuition. She knew that she was beginning to look forward to the suppers with an eagerness that had nothing to do with the food she made and everything to do with his voice, his attention, the particular quality of his company that made her feel, for the first time in 3 years, as though she was actually located in the world rather than watching it from outside a window. And she was afraid of that. She was deeply, rationally, historically afraid of it. because she knew what she had mistaken attraction for before. She had mistaken it for understanding, had mistaken Douglas's boldness for depth, had followed that misidentification all the way west and paid for it in years of careful invisibility. What guarantee did she have that she was not making the same error again, but more quietly? She put this question to herself on a cold October night after Vernon had left and she was washing the supper dishes, listening to the wind work itself up against the windows. She made herself consider it seriously. What did she actually know about Vernon Fletcher? That he was from Georgia, that he had been in the war, that he had spent years in Texas and New Mexico, which implied a long period of rootlessness that could be read as freedom or as running, depending on what you were looking at. That he was competent and kind and unhurried, and that his eyes held patience she did not yet fully understand the source of. She did not know what had made him leave Georgia. She did not know what he had done in the war, specifically. She did not know why he had spent so many years moving before landing in Millhaven, Nevada. She did not know if there was a woman before. She did not know if there were debts. She did not know the things that made a person complicated, which was to say she did not know the things that mattered most. She decided to find out. Not by asking directly, she was too careful for that, and she respected that he had not pried into her own history, but by paying attention. By continuing the suppers and watching what the conversation revealed the way you watch a riverbed to understand the water. What she found, over the next several weeks, was this. Vernon Fletcher had dark places in him, the same as any person who had lived long enough in difficult circumstances. He did not try to hide them, but he did not flaunt them either. He mentioned the war in the oblique way of a man for whom it was not a story but a climate, something he had lived inside, not something that happened to him, and then stopped. He had been 17 when he enlisted with the Confederate Army out of Georgia, which he spoke of, without the apologia of a man seeking approval or the defiance of one seeking argument, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a person who has spent a long time understanding the full dimension of a thing he was too young to understand when he did it. "I believed what I was raised to believe," he said one evening, when Cora, emboldened by 3 glasses of the elderflower cordial she kept for special occasions, had asked him directly about it. "And what I was raised to believe was wrong. There is not a version of that I can package more neatly than that." "That is rarer than it should be," Cora said, "the willingness to say it plainly." "It took me a long time to get there," he said, "and a lot of miles." He paused. "I worked on a cattle drive out of San Antonio for 3 years after the war, long time to think. Then I hired on at a ranch in New Mexico near Mesilla. Good ranch, fair wages. I stayed 7 years. What brought you here?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark range of mountains against the darker sky. "The rancher in Mesilla died," he said. "His son took over and he was a different kind of man." Another pause, shorter. "He had some views about the Mescalero Apache who had been working that land alongside us for years. Views that translated into actions I could not stay for." Cora looked at him. "You left a paying position over that." "I did. That cost something." "Yes," he said simply. "It did." She thought about that for a long time after he left, turning it over. A man who walked away from security on a principle about justice that could be the finest thing about a person, or it could be the pattern of someone who was good at leaving. She held both possibilities open and watched. What she also found in those weeks was the thing she had not been looking for, which was joy. Vernon made her laugh. He did it without trying, which made it more effective. A dry observation delivered so casually that the laughter caught her off guard, and then she was annoyed at herself for laughing. And that made him smile, the quiet smile that had started this whole dangerous situation. And she would look away and feel the laughter in her chest like a small warm fire she had thought was completely out. November came with a sweep of cold that turned the high desert brittle and the windows of her rooms into frames of frost. The suppers moved inside, which changed things. The porch had been a neutral space, outdoor, easily departed. Inside was different. Inside was her things, her walls, her specific private life made physical and visible. The pot of dried lavender on the mantel, the collection of dime novels on the shelf above the window that she kept face in and spine out because she was slightly embarrassed by how much she loved them. The small framed watercolor of Ohio hills that her mother had painted and given her the morning she left. Vernon noticed all of it, she could see him noticing, and he said nothing and touched nothing and asked only about the watercolor, because her glance toward it had been involuntary and he had seen it. "My mother painted it," she said. "She was quite good." "Was," he said gently. "She died 4 years ago, before I came west." Cora set down the dishes she was carrying. She would have found this, she gestured vaguely at all of it, the cramped rooms, the desert out the window, the particular life she had built, baffling. She was a woman who believed in proximity to family as a matter of safety. "And what do you believe?" Cora looked at him. "I believe that the people you choose can be as important as the people you are born to," she said, "if you choose carefully." The word carefully sat between them like a stone in still water, making its rings. It was 3 days after that supper that Millhaven's particular version of complicated arrived, and his name was Carter Oakes. Carter Oakes was the man who held the deed to half of Millhaven's commercial leases, including the one that the feed store owner, a Mr. Bremley, operated under, and including, by extension, the ground lease on the building where Cora's rooms were located. He had inherited this position from his father, who had been a fair man by most accounts, but Carter was not his father, which was the problem. Carter Oakes was 35, good-looking in the slick way of a man who knew it, and had been circling Cora with increasing deliberateness since the spring, which she had been managing with the cool precision she had developed for managing men who confused her solitude for availability. He brought her flowers twice. She thanked him politely, and arranged them in a vase the same way she would have arranged any flowers. He invited her to the summer celebration. She said she had planned to attend independently. He mentioned, with a casualness that was entirely manufactured, that owning the building's land lease meant he could set favorable terms for long-term tenants if he was so inclined. The implication of that statement was something she spent a week trying to convince herself she had misread. She had not misread it. Carter Oakes came to her door on a Thursday evening in early November, which was an evening she had not expected Vernon, and when she opened the door he was standing there with his hat in his hands and his best smile deployed, and behind the smile, barely contained, was something harder and less pleasant. "Miss Cora," he said. He had taken to dropping the misses, which she had also not corrected, for different reasons than why she had not corrected Vernon. She had not corrected Vernon because the formality felt like safety. She had not corrected Carter because she had learned that corrections gave him an opening for debate. "Mr. Oakes," she said. She kept the door at 3/4. "I wanted to speak with you about your lease renewal," he said. "It comes due at the end of January." "I am aware," she said. "I have the payment set aside." "Ah," he said, and something shifted in his face the way a card shifts in a dealer's hand. "There has been a reconsideration of rates for the new year." Cora felt the coldness she had learned to feel when a trap was being shown to her. She looked at him levelly. "What new rate?" He named a figure that was 30% higher than what she had been paying, and she felt it physically in her sternum, the way you feel a blow before you have processed that you have been hit. "That is considerable," she said, in a voice she kept very flat. "Market's gone up," Carter said, with a shrug that did not conceal his satisfaction. "But of course, there are ways to maintain favorable terms for particular tenants." His smile returned, angled differently now. A person who was, say, on better personal terms with the landlord might find more flexibility in these matters. There it was, the thing she had spent 8 months not wanting to see spelled out. Cora held the door and held his gaze and felt the particular fury of a woman who has been handed a choice that is designed to not be a choice. "I appreciate the notice," she said, in the same flat tone. "I will review my options." She closed the door. She stood in her kitchen for a long time after, the fury a cold and precise thing in her chest, doing the arithmetic. The increased rent would require her to nearly double her workload, which was already as full as she could manage. Or she would have to surrender the rooms and find another situation, which in Millhaven meant a boarding house and the loss of the privacy she had built her entire recovery on. Or she could give Carter Oakes what he was implying he wanted, which was not an option she entertained past the fraction of a second it took to categorize and refuse. She did not tell Vernon about it at their next supper. She was a private person, and she handled her own difficulties. But he looked at her across the table at one point with those patient eyes and said, "Something is sitting heavy on you." She looked up. "I am fine." "I know," he said. "I did not ask if you were fine. I said something is heavy." The distinction was so precise that she laughed, involuntarily, a small compressed laugh that had some pain in it, and then she told him. Not because she wanted his help. She was explicit about that, but because she found, to her surprise, that she wanted to say it aloud to someone who was not going to immediately try to fix it or react with the kind of outrage that would require her to manage their emotion on top of her own. Vernon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He has been pressuring you for a while," he said. "It was not a question." "Since spring," she said, "and the lease is a lever, apparently." "There are things that can be done about this," he said carefully. "There are legal approaches to unjust tenancy increases. Millhaven has a circuit judge who comes through quarterly." "I know," Cora said. "The difficulty is that the judge comes through in April, and the lease is due in January, and a legal contest with Carter Oakes requires me to be in good standing in this community while also opposing one of its larger landholders, which is a fine line." Vernon nodded slowly. He was quiet again. She knew he was thinking, not performing thinking, actually working through it, and she let the silence stand. "You should not have to fight him," he said finally. "But you know you can." "I know," she said. The words came out with more certainty than she felt, and then, because of the certainty she was performing, she found she actually felt it. That was one of the strange things about saying true things. Sometimes you had to say them to know they were true. What happened next was not Vernon riding in to solve her problem. She would not have permitted it, and he knew her well enough by then not to attempt it. What happened instead was that Vernon had a conversation with old man Hendricks, who it turned out had been leasing his stable from the Oakes family for 20 years, and had thoughts about the new generation's approach to tenancy. And Hendricks had a conversation with 2 other commercial tenants who had received similar implied pressure from Carter Oakes. And those 3 men brought the matter to the town's informal commercial association. And by the end of November, a formal letter had been drafted and delivered to Carter Oakes, noting that any tenancy increases above the standard annual adjustment rate would be contested collectively through the circuit court. Cora heard about this not from Vernon but from Mrs. Alcott, who heard it from Mr. Bremley, who was one of the 3 tenants. When she next saw Vernon on the street, she stopped him. "You spoke to Hendricks," she said. "I mentioned the situation, yes," he said with perfect equanimity. "I told you I wanted to handle it myself." "You did," he said, "and you did handle it. I simply mentioned to a man who had his own reasons to find it relevant that a pattern existed. What he did with that information was his decision." She looked at him for a long time. The street was busy around them, horses and wagons and the ordinary noise of Millhaven's commerce, and she was aware that this conversation was visible, and that visibility had consequences in a town this size. "You are very careful," she said. "When something matters, yes," he said, and held her gaze for exactly long enough, and then he tipped his hat and continued on his way, and she stood on the sidewalk boards feeling as though the ground had shifted imperceptibly but decisively under her feet. December arrived, and the landscape transformed. Snow came to the Stillwater Range above them, and the cold that descended from it was a different cold than November's, deeper, and with more conviction. Cora stoked the small iron stove in her rooms and worked by lamplight in the evenings, her needle moving through fabric while outside the wind made itself known against the walls. The suppers continued. What changed in December was that they talked differently. The small things conversation had been exhausted, or rather it had built a foundation solid enough that the larger things could stand on it without toppling. Vernon told her about his father, a Georgia farmer who had believed deeply in a way of life that required other people's suffering to sustain, and who had sent his son to war with pride, and whom Vernon had returned to find smaller somehow than the man he had left, as though the end of the war had collapsed something structural inside him. His father had died 3 years after the war. Vernon had not wept at the funeral. He had felt guilty about that for years before he stopped. Cora told him about her mother, the watercolor woman, careful and artistic and practical all at once, and about her father, who had been kind in the distant way of a man who was most comfortable with principles rather than people. She told him about Douglas, not all of it at once, but in pieces that she could examine without being overwhelmed. She told him about the hope she had brought west and what happened to it, and how she had rebuilt from what was left. "What did you keep?" Vernon asked one evening, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, the lamplight making the angles of his face more defined. "I beg your pardon. You said you rebuilt from what was left. What was left?" She thought about it seriously because he was asking seriously and he deserved that. "The marigolds," she said finally, "and the belief that the work I do is worth something, and the knowledge that I am not afraid of hard things." She paused, "and something I am less comfortable naming." "You do not have to name it," he said. "I know," she said, "but I think I should." She looked at the stove, the warm orange light coming through its grate. "I kept the belief that a good person exists somewhere who might want the same kind of quiet that I want. I was not always sure what to do with that belief, but I kept it." The silence after that was charged with something she had no desire to diffuse but also was not ready to ignite. It was Vernon who moved carefully across that silence, not with words, with action. He stood up slowly, as he did at the end of every supper, to take his leave, and when he passed her chair he paused, and then he reached out and very gently, with just 2 fingers, he touched the back of her hand where it rested on the table. Not a hold, not a grasp, just a touch, a acknowledgement. A plain, wordless statement that said, "I hear what you said and I am here." She did not pull her hand away. He left a moment later, and she sat at the table for a long time with her hand still on the wood where his fingers had been, feeling the ghost of the touch and understanding, finally, that she was not going to be able to maintain the careful distance she had set up around herself, and that the only real question now was whether she was brave enough to stop trying. Christmas came to Millhaven with church bells and evergreen boughs nailed above doorways, and a general festive commerce that meant Cora had more alterations work than she could comfortably manage: new dresses for the Christmas dance, adjusted suit coats, a wedding dress that required 3 full fittings because the bride kept changing what she wanted the sleeves to do. Cora worked gladly because work filled the days and kept the internal conversation, the one about Vernon Fletcher and what she was going to do about him, at a manageable volume. Vernon brought her a gift on the 23rd of December. He arrived at her door at midday, which was unusual for their established rhythm, and he was holding something wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine, and he was not wearing his usual settled expression. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, slightly uncertain, which she found extraordinary because uncertainty was not something she had associated with him. "I made something," he said when she opened the door. "I was not sure whether to bring it. I decided to bring it and let you decide what to do with it." She took the package. Inside was a small wooden step stool, beautifully made, the wood sanded so smooth it felt like cloth, the joints perfectly tight, the whole thing sealed with beeswax to a warm glow. On the top surface he had inlaid a small diamond of lighter wood, a gesture of craft beyond pure function. "The step in the workshop at Hendricks is too high for most people," he said, by way of oblique explanation. "I made one for there and found I enjoyed the work. And I thought you might have use for one, given your shelves." She did have high shelves. He had noticed that too, because of course he had. She stood holding the stool and looking at the inlaid diamond and felt something in her that had been very tightly held begin to come loose. "Vernon," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." He waited. "I am afraid," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I have very good reasons to be afraid, and I have arranged my life specifically to manage those reasons, and what is happening between us disrupts that arrangement considerably, and I am frightened by how little that frightens me anymore." He was quiet for a moment that felt geological. Then he said, "I know." And then, "I am not trying to disrupt your arrangement. I am aware that you built it for good reasons and it has served you well. But," she said, "but," he said, "I also cannot pretend that supper is only supper, and I thought you deserved to know that." She looked at him standing in her doorway with the cold December air making his breath visible, patient and steady and carrying his own weight without asking her to carry it for him, and she thought, "Here is the thing I kept." "Would you like to come in," she said, "for supper, tonight?" He smiled. It was not the quiet, careful smile from the celebration, though that was in it. It was larger than that, warmer, with relief in it and something that was not yet allowed to be called joy but was in the neighborhood. "Yes," he said, "I would." That evening was different from every supper that had preceded it, and they both knew it, and the knowing was part of the texture of the evening, present in everything. She cooked better than she normally did a proper roast chicken with root vegetables and biscuits, not to perform, but because she wanted to, and the wanting felt good and she let it. He sat at her table and they talked and ate, and afterwards, when she was washing the dishes, he stood beside her and dried them without being asked, and they were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she did not step away. "Tell me," she said, very quietly, watching her hands in the wash water, "if this is the beginning of something. Because if it is, I need to know it as that. Not as suppers and kindness that might mean nothing." "It is the beginning of something," Vernon said, with the same directness he brought to everything that mattered. "It has been that for a while. I was waiting for you." "For what specifically?" "For you to decide," he said. "It was never going to be my decision to make. You know yourself what you went through. Coming to this at your own speed is not me being passive. It is me understanding that some things cannot be rushed without being broken." She set down the dish she was washing and turned to face him, and the distance between them was very small, and he looked at her with those patient gray-green eyes, and she thought, "I have been so afraid of being wrong again that I nearly talked myself out of being right." She reached up and put her hand against the side of his jaw, just rested it there, and felt the warmth and the slight roughness of his skin, and he went very still in the way of a person receiving something precious that they have been careful with. "I want to try," she said, "properly." "So do I," he said, "more than I know how to say without being ridiculous about it." She laughed, and it was the real laugh, not the surprised, involuntary kind, but the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and glad. He walked home through the cold December dark after supper, and she stood at her window and watched until the darkness swallowed him, and then she turned back to her lit rooms, and they felt different. Not larger, exactly. More inhabited, as though the space had been waiting for a kind of presence that was now beginning to arrive. January was a revelation. It was a revelation in the way that warmth is a revelation when you have been cold for a long time. Not a surprise exactly, since you know warmth exists and that you want it, but staggering nonetheless in the sheer fact of it. Vernon and Cora moved from suppers to deliberate time walks on Sunday after church, when the town was quiet, and the high desert stretched its weekend peace in every direction, and they could talk or not talk, and both were equally good. They moved from hand-holding to the particular honesty of two people who have chosen each other on purpose, which is different from and better than the momentum of two people who have simply not found a reason to stop. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of January, on the path that ran along the base of the ridge east of town, where the winter sun hit the pale rock face and created a pocket of warmth that seemed improbable given the cold around it. She had made an observation about the rock, something about the color, how it turned almost copper in the afternoon light, and when she looked back from the rock to find him looking at her with such unmistakable intention that there was no question about what he was going to do, She decided not to waste a moment and kissed him first. He made a sound of quiet surprise that became something much warmer, and she held the lapel of his coat in her fist, and he put his hands on either side of her face with a tenderness that had nothing of performance in it, and the copper rock turned behind them and the cold air was cold and they were not. "You did that first," he said when they separated, sounding wonderstruck and somewhat undone. "I did," she said. "I was planning to do it." "I know," she said. "I thought we had both been patient long enough." He laughed. It was a full laugh, generous and unself-conscious, and she loved the sound of it with a completeness that settled in her chest like something that had always been there, and had finally been acknowledged. Carter Oakes, having been checked by the collective action of his tenants, and perhaps also having read from the new situation with Cora and Vernon that his particular leverage had evaporated, came through with the lease renewal at the standard rate in February, which he presented as a magnanimous gesture. Cora accepted the papers with polite efficiency and said nothing unkind because she did not require his humiliation, only her own stability. The lease was signed. The rooms were hers on her terms. She went home and put flowers winter-dried ones, there being nothing fresh in February in the vase on the table, and felt the satisfaction of a danger that had been faced and dispatched. She told Vernon about it over supper that evening, and he raised his glass of cider to her across the table. "You said you would handle it," he said. "I said I would handle it," she agreed, and they drank. Spring came to the high desert with its particular theatrical quality, not gradually but all at once, the sage turning vivid, the wildflowers appearing in unlikely color along the rocky slopes, the air losing its winter knife, and finding something tentative and warm instead. Cora planted new marigolds in the window box and felt, for the first time since Douglas died, that the planting was an act of uncomplicated hope rather than willful resistance. She and Vernon had been courting properly for 3 months. The town knew, of course, Millhaven was not a large place, and any development of that kind was public knowledge within 48 hours. Most people seemed pleased or at least interested. Mrs. Alcott declared Vernon a fine young man and then immediately began implying, with the gentle relentlessness of a woman who had strong opinions about the order of things, that the courtship had gone on long enough and perhaps a decision ought to be made. "People talk," Mrs. Alcott said, not unkindly, over tea one April afternoon. "Let them," Cora said serenely. "Cora." "Margaret," Cora said, which stopped Mrs. Alcott because Cora almost never used her first name. "I am being deliberate. That is not the same as being slow." She was being deliberate. She was also, she recognized, waiting for one more thing, waiting to be sure she was not repeating the pattern of mistakes she had made before, not with a different man but with the same internal mechanism, hope outrunning information. What she needed to confirm was the depth she suspected but had not yet tested. The test came accidentally in April when the circuit judge was in town. Cora was in Hadley's dry goods when she overheard a conversation between the judge's clerk and a man she did not recognize, who turned out to be a lawyer's representative from Reno. The conversation was about a property dispute, specifically about a claim that a man named Fletcher, she stopped moving immediately, had abandoned without proper notice, a claim connected to a small horse operation in New Mexico territory. She bought her thread and went home and sat very still for an hour, which was what she did when she needed to think without her emotions accelerating past her thoughts. Then she went to find Vernon. She found him at the stable, shoeing a big roan gelding with the focused ease of a man for whom the work was second nature. She waited until he finished the hoof he was working on because interrupting a farrier mid-shoe was unwise for everyone involved, and then he set down the tools and straightened and saw her face. "Something's happened," he said. "Something may have happened," she said carefully. "Or I may have misheard. There is a lawyer's representative in town about a claim abandonment in New Mexico. The name they mentioned was Fletcher." He was quiet. The roan gelding shifted and he reached up automatically to settle it without looking. "Mesilla," he said. "Yes." he sighed slowly. When I left the ranch in Mesilla, there was a dispute about property improvements. I had built a small paddock and shelter on a section I was using, with the rancher's original permission. When his son took over and our parting was not friendly, he claimed I had abandoned the improvements and owed compensation for materials. I contested it. The contest went nowhere locally because his family had connections with the county clerk. He met her gaze steadily. "It followed me here. Why did you not tell me this?" She said, and kept her voice level because she needed his answer and she could not get it if she made him defensive. "Because I did not know it had followed me here," he said. "I was aware it was unresolved. I should have told you it existed." He held her gaze. "I am telling you now." She looked at him for a long time. "Can it be resolved? With a proper hearing before a judge who does not owe the Mesilla family a favor?" "Yes," he said. "It is a straightforward matter. I have documentation. The original agreement was verbal, which is the weak point, but there were witnesses." "The circuit judge is here now," she said. He understood immediately. "Yes." "Then you should request a hearing," she said. "Resolve it." "I will," he said. And then directly, "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner, not because it changes the facts of the matter, but because you deserve to know the whole of my situation." "Yes," she said, "I did." She held his gaze a moment longer, measuring the emotion she found there. Not the scrambling self-justification of a man caught in something, but the steady acknowledgement of a man who understood he had misjudged and was not going to obscure that. "Thank you for telling me now." She walked home and let herself process it, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands folded as she had sat at the celebration 10 months ago, alone and carrying invisible weight. This, she thought, was the test. Not whether Vernon Fletcher was perfect. She did not want perfect. She had no use for a fiction, but whether he would deal with her honestly in a moment of complication, and whether she could look at a complication in the clear light of actual knowledge, rather than retreating into the old fear that told her anything difficult was a harbinger of disaster. The complication was real but manageable. He had not concealed it maliciously. He had misjudged the timing of disclosure. Those were not the same thing. She knew the difference. She made supper that evening with the steadiness of a woman who had made a decision, and when Vernon came she could see that he had gone through his own reckoning in the hours since their conversation at the stable. "I request the hearing tomorrow," he said, as soon as he sat down. "I know," she said. "I have written down the names of 2 witnesses from Mesilla who were working the ranch when the paddock agreement was made. They have since moved to Carson City, which is within the circuit court's reach." She slid the paper across the table. He looked at the paper for a moment and then at her, and something crossed his face that was more than gratitude. It was the particular moved quality of a man who had braced for judgment and received partnership instead. "You did not have to do that," he said. "You are correct that I did not have to do it," she said. "I chose to. There is a difference." He pressed his lips together briefly, collecting something. "Cora." "Yes." "I love you," he said, without preamble or qualifying language, direct in the way he was direct about everything that mattered. "I have loved you since at least December and probably before that, and I want to say it clearly rather than accumulate evidence of it and hope you notice." The word arrived in her chest like the touch of warm sun after a long winter, something that should be ordinary but is not. She had not said this word to anyone in years. She had told herself she might not say it again. Looking at Vernon Fletcher across her kitchen table, his honest eyes holding hers, she thought about the woman she had been at the celebration, alone on the bench, invisible in a crowd, holding a cup that had appeared beside her like a small miracle of someone seeing her, and the woman she was now, who had made a choice about herself and who was not afraid of this particular word, in this particular moment, with this particular man. "I love you," she said. The words felt like the window box marigolds turning toward the light. The hearing before the circuit judge was held on a Thursday in late April, and it was expeditious. With the 2 former Mesilla Ranch hands providing sworn testimony, done by written affidavit through the Carson City Court, per established procedure, and Vernon's documentation of the original agreement, the claim against him was dismissed. The Messilla family's representative, who had been in town at some expense, departed Millhaven on the Friday morning stage with nothing to show for it, and Vernon Fletcher's record in Nevada territory was clean as a page. That Friday evening, Vernon arrived at Cora's door not at supper time but in the late afternoon, which was unusual, and he was not holding anything in his hands, not a gift, not his hat, just his hands, and his expression was the most undisguised she had ever seen it. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood in the middle of her kitchen, which was the room where they had built most of this, and he said, "I want to marry you. I want to do this properly, and I want to be honest that I am asking not because it is the expected next step, but because being your husband is specifically what I want, because you are the most remarkable person I have met in 40 years of meeting people, and because I believe I understand what you need and I intend to go on understanding it, and I will not ask you to be anything other than what you are." He was 36. She had learned some months back. She was 27. Their years had been lived differently but arrived, it turned out, at a compatible place. She stood in her kitchen and looked at this man who had sat down next to her without asking, left space between them, told her she did not have to talk, and over the course of less than a year had become the thing she had kept when everything else fell away. "Yes," she said, not after deliberation, not with conditions or qualifications, but clearly and fully, the way she had learned to say the things that were true. "Yes, I will marry you." He crossed the room and took her hands in both of his, and they stood like that for a moment, the early evening light coming through the window, the marigolds yellow bright in their box, the stove ticking in the corner, the whole specific geography of the life she had built surrounding the thing she was beginning. They were married in June of 1883, at the Millhaven Methodist Church, on a Saturday morning when the Nevada sky was the specific shade of blue that seems to have no ceiling. Cora wore a dress of ivory cotton that she had made herself, with small embroidered flowers at the cuffs and collar that had taken her 3 weeks of evening work and were worth every hour. Vernon wore a suit that was new and properly fitted, and that he had asked Cora to advise on the fit of, which she had done with professional precision, and a private delight she had not disguised as much as she thought she had. Mrs. Alcott wept, which she had predicted she would not do, and which everyone else had predicted she would. Old man Hendricks stood as Vernon's witness, beaming like a man who had invested in a good horse and watched it win. The ceremony was simple and honest, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Vernon kissed her at the front of that little church, it was with the same careful attention he had brought to everything since the beginning, and also with more joy than careful attention, so that she laughed against his mouth and he laughed too, and the church laughed with them. They took over a proper house after the wedding, a small adobe structure on the east side of Millhaven's Main Street that had been empty since the previous occupant moved north to Idaho. It had 2 proper rooms and a real kitchen and a parlor and a bedroom, and a yard with enough space for a serious garden, which Cora intended to have. She planted marigolds along the front path, and also tomatoes and squash, and a row of sunflowers against the back fence, because she had always wanted sunflowers and had never had a yard in which to put them. Vernon's work at Hendrick's stable continued, and he was good at it and respected for it, and in the evenings he came home to Cora's lit windows and the smell of supper, and the domestic ordinary extraordinary reality of being someone's husband, which he had privately given up expecting to be, and which he found to be the best thing he had ever stumbled into being. They were happy. Not in the story-simple way that flattens happiness into a destination reached, but in the daily, textured, sometimes difficult and always worthwhile way that happiness is when it is shared between 2 people who are honest with each other about both the good days and the hard ones. There were hard ones. Cora's alterations business had a difficult summer when a general drought in the region suppressed everyone's spending, and 3 of her regular customers went without new orders for months. Vernon's earnings covered their needs, but it was tight, and they both felt the tightness. And there was a week in August when they were short-tempered with each other in the way of two people under financial strain, which resolved itself when Cora took on 3 new customers from the mining camp a few miles east, whose wives had been managing with poorly fitting clothing for years, and the income stabilized. The hard weeks taught them something useful about each other, that they could disagree and be short-tempered and come back to it, and talk honestly about what had happened without one or the other requiring the disagreement to be deleted from the record. This was not something Cora had experienced in her first marriage, where conflict always ended in Douglas's grand dismissiveness and her own suppressed frustration. With Vernon, the argument was a conversation that was temporarily uncomfortable, not a threat to the structure of them. That was worth knowing. In the fall of 1883, Cora discovered she was pregnant, which she worked out from symptoms and calendar with the practicality of a woman who did not require confirmation to understand evidence. She told Vernon on a Sunday evening in October when they were sitting in the parlor, she with her sewing and he with a book, and the lamplight was warm over both of them. "I am expecting," she said simply. He set the book down so deliberately that she could see he was controlling his expression while it went through several things. Then it landed on the thing that was truest, which was a joy so large and unguarded that he looked young in it. "Cora," he said. "I know," she said, smiling. He came to her and knelt beside her chair, which was not something he normally did because he was not a theatrical man, but this was outside the territory of normal, and he took her hands in his and held them. "Are you well?" he said. How do you feel?" "Like myself," she said. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise like myself. We should see Dr. Mead." "We should and we will," she said. "On Tuesday. I have already thought of this." He laughed quietly, that full, generous laugh. "Of course you have." She put her hand on his face the way she had that December night when she first made the choice about him. "I am glad," she said. "I want you to know that. I am very glad." "So am I," he said, and the words were so insufficient for what was in his face that neither of them tried to add anything to them, and the silence was full of everything they meant. The pregnancy proceeded with the particular combination of exhilaration and exhaustion that is universal to the condition and varies only in its specific flavor. Cora's morning sickness was real and annoying, but contained to mornings, which meant she could work in the afternoons without interruption. She continued the alterations business through the winter, though she reduced her client load by a third at Vernon's gentle urging after she fell asleep over a seam one evening in January and woke up with a pattern piece stuck to her cheek. Vernon became, through the winter months, a domestic figure she would not have predicted from the man she had first observed competent and self-sufficient in his professional life, but which she found she should have predicted, because it was entirely consistent with the character she had been reading for a year. He took on the cooking on the evenings when she was too tired to stand at the stove. He carried water and wood without discussion. He read to her in the evenings, which had started as an occasional thing and became every night, her with her feet up and her mending or nothing in her hands, him with the book, his low voice going through whatever they were reading. He liked history, and she liked novels, and they had found a pleasant negotiated rotation between the two. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a Tuesday, in the adobe house with Dr. Mead in attendance, and Mrs. Alcott providing the kind of vigorous moral support that mostly consisted of reminding everyone, including Dr. Mead, what needed to be done. It was a long labor, 17 hours and hard, and Cora was fierce and exhausted through all of it in the way that the hardest things make a person fierce. And when it was over and the child was placed in her arms, a boy, healthy, lunged and dark-haired, emphatically present in the world, she looked down at him and felt something so enormous and uncomplicated that she could not contain it and did not try. Vernon was allowed in immediately after, and he stood beside the bed and looked at the two of them with the expression of a man who is trying to commit something to permanent memory, pressing every detail of it into a place where it cannot be reached by time or loss. He put one finger against the baby's cheek very gently, and the baby turned toward it with the instinctive, insistent reflex of the newborn, and Vernon made a sound low in his chest that Cora had never heard from him before, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something in between. "Hello," he said to the baby, very softly. "I am your father." Cora watched him and felt the love she had for him adjust and enlarge, the way a house expands when something new is brought into it, finding rooms it did not previously have. They named the boy James after no one in particular, because they had each had complicated relationships with their families of origin and wanted this person to be his own name from the beginning. James Fletcher grew, as infants do, with the terrifying speed of something that does not acknowledge the desire to slow time. He was a round-faced, serious-eyed baby who observed the world with an intensity that made Mrs. Alcott declare he had his mother's way of looking at things, which Cora chose to take as a compliment. By summer's end, he was beginning to smile at Vernon's voice specifically, which Vernon considered the finest thing that had ever happened to him professionally or otherwise. Millhaven grew through the mid-1880s as the railroad expanded its reach into the Nevada territory, bringing new settlers and new commerce, and some of the new difficulties that progress drags in with it. More people meant more complexity, more of the Western America that was in active, sometimes violent contest with itself about what it was becoming and at whose expense. The Paiute peoples of the Great Basin, who had been living in this land for generations before the settlers arrived, were increasingly pressed by the expansion, their treaty rights inconsistently honored, their lands reduced. Cora was aware of this in the abstract way that most white settlers in the territory were aware of it, which is to say incompletely, and she began to be more specifically aware of it through Vernon, who had worked alongside indigenous people in New Mexico, and did not share the casual dismissiveness that many of their neighbors had about the injustice of what was happening. "We are sitting in the middle of something that will be understood very differently in 50 years than it is today," he said one evening, in the reflective tone he used when he was working through something difficult. "Yes," Cora said. "The question is what we do with that understanding now, not later." "Limited options in our position," he said, "but not zero. There is a woman who sells pottery at the market, Sarah, one of the northern Paiute people, who has been having trouble with the marshal over her trading licenses, paperwork that keeps disappearing." Cora looked at him steadily. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that does not exist for white merchants but materializes reliably for her." "I could take in some alterations work from the families at the camp east of town," Cora said carefully, "which would mean I have an established business reason to be known among people the town would rather pretend are not there, which is a small thing." "Small things accumulate," Vernon said. "They do," she said, and they left it there for the night. But in the weeks that followed, Cora expanded her client network in the deliberate way she had always expanded anything that mattered, carefully, consistently, with the long view rather than the immediate one. In the spring of 1886, she was pregnant again. This time she knew it sooner and told Vernon sooner, and his face went through the same sequence as before but with more practiced ease and the same final landing in the full, unguarded joy. "Are you happy about a second?" she said, watching him. "I am deliriously happy about a second," he said without hesitation. "James is wonderful and also exhausting, and it will be good for him to have someone to practice being a person with." James was 2 years old, walking with great confidence and falling with even greater frequency, and possessed of an opinion about nearly everything that he communicated in a combination of English words and elaborate gestures. He had Vernon's coloring and Cora's intensity, and the particular Fletcher Rourke stubbornness that both his parents recognized and took equal and perhaps disproportionate pride in. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1886, small and dark-eyed and possessed of a clarity of expression that Cora recognized from the mirror. They named her Alina, which was Cora's mother's middle name, which felt right in a way that could not be argued with. James was fascinated by Alina with the magnanimous bewilderment of a 2-year-old confronted with something smaller than himself. He stood beside her basket and looked at her with intense seriousness for long periods. Vernon recorded this in a letter to his cousin in Tennessee, the only family member with whom he had maintained any correspondence, and the letter's description of James studying Alina the way a man studies a map of unknown territory made Cora laugh when Vernon read it aloud to her. Life in Millhaven in the late 1880s arranged itself into a shape that Cora, if she had been asked to describe it, would have called full. Not perfect, she would not have claimed perfect, because she had too much respect for complexity to flatten her happiness into something without texture, but genuinely, durably full. Vernon's reputation as a farrier had grown to the point where people from neighboring towns made the journey specifically for his work, and Hendricks had offered him a partial ownership stake in the stable, which he had accepted after consulting with Cora about the financial terms with the seriousness of two people who made decisions together. Cora's alterations business had grown as the town grew, and she had taken on an apprentice, a young woman named Maitsuji, the daughter of a Japanese family who had come west with the railroad construction and stayed, whose cleverness with a needle was exceptional, and whose situation in a town that was not always welcoming to her family required the kind of deliberate support that Cora was now practiced at giving. May worked for Cora 3 days a week, and the arrangement was good for both of them. In 1888, the summer celebration came around again, as it did every year, and this time Cora was not sitting alone on the edge of it. She was standing with Vernon and James, who was 4 and had recently developed strong opinions about fireworks, and Alina on Vernon's hip because she was not quite 2, and the noise required a reliable height advantage. They were in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by neighbors and the ongoing noise of a town that was theirs, and Cora looked across the celebration square and found herself looking at the bench on the far edge where she had sat alone 6 years ago in her dark green dress, waiting to be noticed and afraid of what it would mean if she was. Vernon followed her gaze, or perhaps he did not need to follow it, perhaps he simply knew. "The bench," he said. "The bench," she said. "You look like you were holding the entire weight of something," he said. She turned to look at him. "I was," she said. "I was holding the weight of being afraid to want something, which is one of the heaviest things." He looked at her with the sage-rain eyes that she had spent 6 years learning the full depth of, which turned out to be very deep, deeper than she had estimated that first evening, and she had estimated generously. "Are you afraid now?" he said. She considered the question honestly, because that was what she owed both of them. Alina was patting Vernon's collar with the determined sociability of the almost 2-year-old. James was pressed against her side watching the dancers with his particular focused intensity. The fiddles were playing the same kind of music they had always played at these celebrations, bright and insistent. The bonfire sent its sparks up into the summer dark. "No," she said, "I am not afraid." He smiled. It was the quiet smile from the beginning, the careful, considered one that had started everything. But under it now was everything that had been built on top of it. Years of honest conversation and supper tables and laughter, and the kind of difficult and the kind of wonderful that only accumulate through time and trust. "Good," he said. She took James's hand and leaned into Vernon's side, and felt the solid reality of the life she had chosen. The life she had built from what was left when everything she had mistakenly trusted had fallen away. And it was so far beyond anything that the careful, bricked-up woman on the bench would have permitted herself to hope for, that she could only be grateful genuinely, specifically, bone-deep grateful, for the 2 cups of cider and 1 quiet smile that had opened the door. James pulled at her hand. "Mama, I want to dance." "Then we will dance," she said. "Papa too," James said firmly. "Papa too," Vernon agreed, already moving, Alina on his arm, his other hand finding Cora's. the four of them moving toward the fiddles and the firelight and the dancing crowd of people who were their neighbors and their town, and the ordinary texture of a shared life. Later, much later, when the children were asleep and the celebration had quieted and they were walking home through the warm Nevada dark, their hands linked, the stars overhead so thick they seemed to lean down, Vernon said, "I have been thinking about expanding the stable operation." "How much expanding?" "A second stable, possibly, on the north side of town. The growth is moving that direction." She thought about it, walking. "The capital requirement. Manageable, with the partnership stake I have now. It would be several years of lean margins while the second location establishes itself." "Tell me more about the north side location," she said, "specifically the land situation." He told her, and she listened, and they talked about it all the way home, the practical and the visionary cycling together the way they always did when they planned. She providing the structural caution that kept them from overextending. He providing the forward-looking ambition that kept them from standing still. By the time they reached their adobe house with its sunflowers silhouetted against the night sky, they had the broad strokes of a plan and a list of questions to resolve. They went inside. She checked the children, James a sprawled, profoundly asleep 4-year-old, Alina tucked and peaceful, and then stood in the kitchen filling the stove against the desert's night cool, and Vernon came to stand behind her and put his arms around her, his chin at her temple, and they stood together in their kitchen in the lamplight in the house they had made into a home. "Vernon," she said. "Cora," he said. "I am glad you sat down," she said. "That night at the celebration." He made the sound low in his chest that she had come to know as his version of something too large for words. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." She turned in his arms and kissed him, and he held her, and outside the marigolds were dark in their beds along the front path, waiting for the morning sun to turn them their particular brilliant, impossible gold. The second stable opened in the spring of 1890, and by autumn it was profitable in its modest, steady way. James started school that same fall, which he approached with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything, and promptly became the child whose hand went up with the answer before the teacher had finished asking the question, which his teacher found impressive, and his classmates found variable. Alina, at nearly 4, was already following her mother around the alterations workshop with the proprietary air of a child who has decided she belongs somewhere and intends to make her belonging official. Mei Tsuji, Cora's apprentice, had grown skilled enough by 1890 that she was producing alterations work as fine as Cora's own, and Cora offered her a proper partnership arrangement, splitting the income and the client load, which May accepted with the same careful dignity with which she approached everything. The arrangement transformed the business from a single woman's enterprise into something with more resilience, and Cora found that sharing the work she loved made it larger rather than smaller, which was the thing about partnership that the fearful, solitary version of herself would not have believed. In 1891 she was pregnant a third time, which she received with the settled joy of a woman for whom this was no longer a territory of fear. Vernon, at the news, smiled the quiet smile over supper and reached across the table for her hand and held it for a long moment, and James, who was 7 and observant, looked at them and said, "Is there going to be another baby?" "There is," Cora said. James considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old assessing a significant development. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We do not know yet," Vernon said. "I want a brother," James said. "Alina is fine, but she wants to be in charge of everything." "You both do," Cora said, amused. "Yes," James said, "but if there is another one who does, that is 2 against 1, which is not fair." The third child was indeed a boy, born in the spring of 1892, whom they named Thomas, and who arrived with considerably less drama than his predecessors, and proceeded to be a tranquil, good-natured infant who slept when placed in his cradle, and watched the world with a calm wonder that seemed to belong to a different family than his brother and sister. Alina, at 5, took it upon herself to be his primary interpreter to the adults, a role she performed with authority. Millhaven grew into a proper town through the 90s, new buildings on the main street, a proper school building, a second church, a small newspaper that Cora read carefully and occasionally wrote letters to regarding matters of local importance. The railroad had made the region more connected and more complicated, as railroads always did, and the complications included the ongoing tension around land rights and the treatment of the indigenous peoples of the region that she had watched and thought about and, in small ways, continued to act against in the way that she had adopted. Deliberately, consistently, imperfectly, but without stopping. She and Vernon were 40. She was 37. He was 42 in the spring of 1897, and Millhaven was entirely theirs in the sense that a place becomes yours. Not by deed, though they held deeds now, but by the accumulation of mornings and conversations and emergencies managed and celebrations attended, and the specific geography of a life lived somewhere long enough that it holds the shape of you in return. One evening in that spring, the long desert evening stretching its gold over the Stillwater Range, Cora and Vernon sat on the porch of their adobe house, a proper porch now with chairs, because Vernon had built them 5 years ago, and they had spent every fine evening since on them. And the 3 children were inside doing the things their ages required. James at 15 helping Alina with arithmetic, while Thomas at 5 reorganized the bookshelf for reasons of his own. The marigolds were in bloom along the front path. The sunflowers were starting up along the back fence. The distant mountains held the last of the sun with characteristic Nevada generosity. "Tell me what you are thinking," Vernon said, which was not an unusual opening between them. They had been opening conversations this way for 15 years. "I am thinking," Cora said, looking at the marigolds, "that I sat on a bench in this town 14 years ago feeling entirely invisible, and that I am now so specifically, particularly visible to someone that I cannot remember what invisibility felt like." "Is that a good thing?" he said, though from his voice he knew the answer. "It is the best thing," she said. "It is the thing I kept." He reached over from his chair to hers and took her hand, in the direct, unhurried way he had always done things, and they sat together in the last of the Nevada light, their hands linked, the sound of their children inside, the marigolds opening their gold to the end of a good day, and everything that had been broken made whole, and everything that had been withheld now given, and the long, complicated, brave story of Cora Rourke completed exactly as it should have been, not without difficulty, not without cost, but with love at the center of it, real and chosen and sustained, which is the only kind that lasts.